Do you say biopic or biopic? Let me know in the comments because I used to say the former and then someone shamed me into the latter, which I've been saying until literally yesterday when Google told me I had it the first time. So I'm kind of bitter right now. There's something odd about the way that we as audience members view media based on a real person or true events. I think we all know deep down that movies and TV shows based on a true story aren't perfectly depicting that true story. Timelines and events are shifted or fabricated. Characters are created or combined or removed. But even so, we will largely assume that what we are shown is true unless it goes out of its way to explain why it's not. Like, if you don't have those clarification end cards that followed Chernobyl, how many people are actually going to look up what was altered for our dramatic enjoyment? Not that many. And so people will go around assuming that that was the way it was, because how much does it really matter if what we think is a little bit wrong? Most of the time, not at all. But because so many of us take these based on a true story films at face value, it means that events and actions in them don't need to be justified in quite the same way. Truth is stranger than fiction in part because sometimes reality just makes no sense, and sometimes real motivations don't follow some interesting dramatic through line. So when a character based on a real person does something, you're probably going to be more willing to accept it even if it feels like the film hasn't really explained why. Because the person did the thing. So what am I going to complain about? Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week Air Review. You can call me Alec, no X, thank you very much. And today, I am talking about the fourth entry in Steve McQueen's Small Axe series, Alec's Wheatle. In David Fincher's Mank, his most recent film about the man who wrote Citizen Kane and the circumstances which led him to write it, Gary Oldman as the titular Herman J. Mankiewicz says, "You cannot capture a man's entire life in 2 hours. All you can hope is to leave the impression of one." He is, of course, talking about the screenplay he's been tasked with writing, but it's clearly a meta-commentary on biopics in general, as well as the biopic in which the line is being said. And so it's appropriate that Mank the film doesn't make any serious attempt to capture Mank the man's entire life. Instead, it focuses on 2 brief periods in order to give us the impression, and it works beautifully. Small Axe's third entry, Red, White, and Blue, successfully gives an impression of its inspiration, Leroy Logan, by focusing only on one period. And the shortened timeline allows the shortened runtime of a mere 80 minutes to nonetheless depict enough of Logan's story to make you feel like you get what makes him tick. But even if you didn't, you can see from the film's title that it's not just about him. Red, White, and Blue was not a nickname a la Mank, it's the colors of the British flag. And so we are told right from the outset that even though it is Leroy Logan's story, Leroy Logan is not the entirety of the story. Logan is really a vessel. The fact that he's a real person is almost irrelevant, and the lack of an end card updating us on the life he lived afterward makes that feel definitively the case. Red, White, and Blue wants to show us what would drive a black man in 1980s London to join the police department, and how poorly that would go. And then it's done. Duty fulfilled, we're off to the next film. And I get it. I wouldn't have minded seeing more of Logan's life, but I understand why we don't have to. But I don't understand why Alec's Wheatle, a film specifically named for its title character and actual human inspiration, is even shorter than Red, White, and Blue. This is a film much more interested in showing us a life, depicting a number of events taking place over a number of years. Yet at barely more than 60 minutes long, Alec's Wheatle has very little time to leave even an impression of its protagonist. Which is a shame, because the man on whom the film is based clearly has an interesting life story. Wheatle is a British novelist who was orphaned and then brought up in an abusive home and lived around racist as hell white kids in Surrey before eventually coming to Brixton, where he completely failed to blend in because he dressed, sounded, and acted too white. but eventually adapted and then became a part of his surroundings, dealing weed, DJing house parties like the type depicted in Small Axe's second entry, Lover's Rock, etc. This until the 1981 Brixton riots, after which he was arrested and sentenced. While incarcerated, his Rastafarian cellmate Simeon convinces him to read more books and focus on his education, and that inspires him to become a writer, though we don't see that. Unfortunately, everything I just told you is everything that happens in Alex Wheatle. And in fact, that probably makes it sound like more happened in the film than really does. And because it's just jumping to these milestone moments, we never get to really understand Wheatle. Because there's no smooth transitions, he just is one way until we're in a scene where he's not. And sure, given the 60-ish minute limitation, that's how it has to be. But the limitation was self-imposed, so I don't get why we aren't allowed to feel the transformation. Wheatle was a very, and I think justifiably, angry kid, as we see, but that kind of goes away until a moment when he suddenly blows up at his closest friend Dennis, and there it feels really out of nowhere because the frustration that he's feeling isn't explained. He has to tell us why he's angry in that moment because there was no time to just understand it beforehand. This is exacerbated by the film taking nearly 5 minutes at the 3/4 mark to leave its subject entirely and focus on the 1981 New Cross fire, during which 13 kids ages 14 to 22 were killed during a house party. There's no word to describe that but tragedy, and when the police just assumed that there was no foul play involved and wrote the whole thing off, it led to widespread protests, in part led by Darcus Howe, who plays a critical role in Small Axe's first film, Mangrove. Rather than recreating this, we are shown archival photos of the events themselves, with verses from Jamaican spoken word artist Linton Kwesi Johnson's New Cross Massacre played over them. It's a powerful sequence that also looks like a slideshow presentation, and that is incredibly jarring. And I imagine that's sort of the point. The event was jarring and then caused a huge wave in the community as they took to the streets, but in the moment, I was confused. And even in retrospect, I wasn't thinking about how its placement in Alex Wheatle's story felt strange. I was thinking about how Alex Wheatle's placement in Brixton Riot's story felt strange. And yet I understand why this film is here in Small Axe the way it is, and why. Because Alex Wheatle feels like Small Axe in microcosm. It features the political protests of Mangrove and the house parties of Lover's Rock. It is a biography like Red, White, and Blue that features a man trying to figure out his place in the world and the stress that puts on him and his relationships. And we've got Simeon here shouting about the importance of education, and that education is what leads Wheatle to the next part of his life. I haven't seen the 5th entry yet, but it's literally called Education. Like, come on. Alex Wheatle reminds us of where we have been while priming us for where we have yet to go. And frankly, it's kind of genius. And it highlights the importance of sequencing that I have been talking about in every video since Lover's Rock. With each passing film, it has become clearer to me why this was treated and released as an anthology, something I wasn't sure about when I watched the fully self-contained Mangrove. Last week, I argued that Red, White, and Blue was the first to feel like it needed to be part of an anthology. But this one, I feel Alex Wheatle only works inside of one. And there's a subtle but important distinction there. Red, White, and Blue can work on its own, even if I don't think it should. But I'm not sure that Alex Wheatle could. Without the context built up by the other films, its brevity would be even more frustrating. The more that I'm left wanting, I feel like I would be left raging for. But fortunately, it's not its own thing. It is part of this complex series of threads tugging at each other and weaving into something far more than the sum of its parts, and it has been truly fascinating for me as I go through each piece trying to fit it all together. Look, Alex Wheatle is the weakest film in the Small Axe series, but also This is Steve McQueen. Even his worst movies are above most directors' best. 7.5 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamrian Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, Magnolia Denton, Elliot Fowler, Greg Lucina, Werner van Alphen, Liam Knipe, Kojo, Phil Bates, Willow, and I Am the Sword. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I don't care. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you in the next one.